So hi everybody, and welcome to another Dragon Metrics training webinar that we're doing. Today I'm super excited because we're joined by Augustin, who is going to be teaching us something that I actually have no idea about, which is SQL. Oh, sorry, not SQL, BigQuery for SEO, which is something completely different to what I was talking about. So there you can see that's my level of expertise that we're dealing with. So I'm sure that there'll be lots to learn. And Augustin, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone. So you're not entirely wrong, Sarah, because we're going to talk about SQL and BigQuery because it's linked. We'll see why in a few moments. I'm going to share my screen very quickly, and it should work, I think. Normally, it should work, so full screen. All right, let's go. So first of all, I'm going to present myself very quickly. I'm an SEO digital analytics consultant. I work for my own agency. We're two people in it only. It's based in Canada, but I work with international clients. I also work with BigQuery.pro. If you want to check it out, we have a training coming up very soon regarding what we're going to discuss today. So if you want to have more details, you can go check BigQuery.pro. The training is getting prepared very soon. So let's check what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk about BigQuery, SQL, or SQL, whatever you call it, because people use the two terms for SEO. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Google Search Console bulk export. And we'll start to see together what is the Google Search Console bulk export. As you can see, I use the acronym GSC for Google Search Console. I hope everyone is fine with that. And we'll talk about BigQuery as well, for people who don't know about BigQuery. Then we'll talk about why it's useful, why it's interesting for you. Then what are the limitations, because nothing is perfect, right? There are always limitations. Then we'll see what type of analysis and what type of insights you can get out of this. Then we'll see how to set it up. You will see that it's very, very simple. That's one of the biggest advantage, I think, of this solution. And lastly, we'll see some examples in BigQuery together, very simple ones, just to show you how it works and what we can do with it. You'll see it's very basic what I'm going to show you, but it's just to show you what it looks like and what it basically does in BigQuery specifically. All right. And like Sarah mentioned, if you have questions, do not hesitate. I will gladly reply. All right, so let's start. The first question is, what is the Google Search Console bulk export? So it's a new, relatively new, because it's not that new anymore in our world. 1 year is quite a lot, actually. But in early 2023, Google announced this new feature, which is basically a free automatic export of the Search Console data into BigQuery. And as I mentioned here, it's a daily export, meaning that every day the data of 1 or 2 days ago is exported. And it's raw data, meaning that it's as detailed data as you can get from the Search Console. We'll see later on what it implies specifically. So basically what it does is it sends data to BigQuery and store it, and you can use it later on in BigQuery directly or with tools plugged to BigQuery without needing to use the UI or the API. So that's what it is. So let's talk a little bit about BigQuery, because we can't, like, for people who don't know what BigQuery is, we cannot mention, we have to mention it at some point to explain what it is, because it's important to understand what it is. So BigQuery is a very, you probably heard about it, even if you don't know about it specifically, but it's an extremely important platform for in the Google ecosystem, because it's basically a storage solution in the cloud. It's offered in the Google Cloud Platform from Google. It's one of the solutions in the Google Cloud Platform. So it allows you to store your data in tables, or you can do more than tables, but basically it stores data in the cloud. All right. So it's a database, basically. It's made for big data, as its name implies, BigQuery. So it means that it's been built, it's been designed to be super fast, super efficient when you have a huge amount of data. So you can query, you can work with data, with gigs of data within seconds only. Whereas if anyone used, for instance, Python or different solutions which use like scripts and this type of stuff, sometimes it can be very slow. It can take a long time to go through data sets. So BigQuery is really efficient for that. The third element to know about BigQuery, we'll talk about pricing a little bit later on, but it's quite cheap. It's even like very cheap, we can say. So it's also something to know about. There is an API that you can use with BigQuery. So it's useful. For instance, I have Python scripts that I use to pull data from BigQuery and even write data in BigQuery. So you can use software and different solutions plugged into a BigQuery, which can be useful sometimes. And lastly, what's very nice also is that BigQuery is integrated into the Google Cloud Platform, meaning that it can be used in conjunction with other solutions from Google Cloud, like, for instance, the natural language API. We'll talk about some applications later on, but you can, for instance, use NLP to analyze the keywords and this type of stuff. So it's another big advantage, the fact that you can use Google Cloud connected to different solutions as well. All right, so that was about BigQuery. I hope it's very clear. You'll let me know if you have questions, obviously. Yeah, that's what BigQuery is. So the next question is, why do we want to use the bulk export? Why do I ask that question? Because as an SEO myself, when I see a new tool, a new solution, or different tools, whatever, I always ask the question, why do I need to add that tool or that solution into my tech stack? We have so many tools nowadays that sometimes we don't really see the point. So we'll see why it's interesting. And you will see that it's not perfect. It doesn't do everything. It doesn't address every issue or needs. But you will see that it's very useful for some reasons. So here are the advantages. So let's go through them together. So the first thing that is very interesting is that for people who really like and want to use the Google Search Console data coming from Google and use the UI or the API currently, this method, this way of using the data is more detailed. As I mentioned earlier, you get raw data, so you don't get sampling or stuff like this. And moreover, you get more fields than with the API, for instance. I was working with the API the other day. With the API, you have only a few fields. Right? I don't remember the amounts, but it's like 5, 7, 8 fields only. Whereas with the bulk exports, you get many fields that allow you to segment your data and do different things. I'm going to be very honest with you. There are many fields in the bulk export that I never use because they're extremely granular, but it's nice to have in some cases. If you want to analyze your AMP results, for instance, or this type of stuff, it doesn't happen every day, but it's nice to have. That's it. So that's the first advantage, the fact that you get a lot of data compared to the UI and even the API. One additional example of why the extra data that you get is interesting is that I don't know if you're aware. I'm asking that because when I talk about it, a lot of people are not aware of that. But in the data you get from the UI or even the API, there is some information that are kept from you. One of them is the anonymized queries. Anonymized queries are basically queries that were kept away for privacy reasons. So Google does not give you all your statistics in the UI or even in the API. So the export does give you statistics. It means that you can see the amount of clicks, the amount of impressions, and more that those anonymized queries generated. and you are able to see some data regarding this. Obviously, you will not see the queries because they are anonymized, but you are able to have some additional information that you won't have anywhere else. So it's another element. I'm going to be honest with you regarding that as well. In some cases, it doesn't really matter, but it's always nice to see what's missing and what is a part of your data that is missing. Another big advantage, and this one is really related to the UI, if you use a Search Console UI, is the fact that, I don't know if you know this, but in every report in the Search Console, you are limited to 1,000 rows, which is a huge limitation. If you want to analyze the keywords for one page, for instance, and your page ranks on more than 1,000 keywords, you will be limited to 1,000 keywords if you are looking at the keywords dimension. There are ways to work around that even in the UI by using segmentation, dates, or stuff like this, but still you will be limited to it. And if you work with websites with a lot of traffic, with a lot of data, this might be a big limitation in the UI, okay? By the way, the API does not necessarily have that limitation, but the UI has it. So it's a big advantage. We don't have that type of limitation with the bulk export. Another huge advantage is that you probably know, if you use the Search Console quite often, that you are limited to 16 months of data in the UI. And the API has the same limitations. There are no ways to go over the last 16-month limitation. Well, the bulk export allows you on paper, because it depends on when you set up the bulk export, but you will see later on that it's not that magical. But if you are able to store more than 60 months, you can analyze more than 60 months, meaning that if you, over a few years, you will be able to analyze like 3, 4, 5 years of data from the Search Console, which is not something you could do in the UI or the API. We'll see later on why it's interesting. Another advantage is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, Google BigQuery is basically a database, meaning that if you use the bulk export, you basically take your Search Console data out of the Search Console, and you can use it outside. And you can even pull it out from BigQuery if you want. I have some clients who do that if they want to store this data in their own data warehouse, for instance. So it's a way to take it out for free. We'll say later on that there is no cost initially. There might be cost over time, but initially there is no cost. Another big advantage is the fact that you can blend. So blend, for people who don't necessarily understand what it means in the case of data, but you can basically you can blend data from different sources. So not only the Search Console, you can blend it with other tools, other solutions. We'll talk about some examples later on. And you can do it directly in BigQuery if you want, which is quite interesting. Because it's relatively cheap, like I mentioned earlier, and it's not that complicated to do as well. You can also run complex calculations operations because, as I mentioned earlier, BigQuery is a solution that is meant to be super efficient, super fast, and also it allows you to basically do calculations. We'll see later on with SQL, which is quite interesting. And lastly, there are connectors with Looker Studio. It's not the only solution you can use to visualize data coming from BigQuery, but you can, Looker Studio, for instance, as a native connector with Looker Studio. So you can quite easily create some data visualization from this tool, BigQuery. All right, so those are the advantages. I hope you see why it's interesting. We'll see right after why it's not necessarily for everyone, but you will see that you should consider it at least. So what are the limitations? Why is it not necessarily for everyone? So the first limitation, unfortunately, is the fact that you need to use SQL or SQL, whatever you call it, to take the data out and to actually pull the data and see what you want to see from it. Because as I mentioned, BigQuery is a database. It's an SQL-based database. So it means that you need to use SQL to take the data out and to analyze and have insights. Otherwise, you're not going to go very far. So it's a big limitation because you need to know SQL, or you need to have a resource who does know SQL. So I'm going to be honest with you. Yes, it's a limitation. Myself, I'm not a huge fan of SQL, even though it's not necessarily super complex, but you need to learn it, and everyone knows, I think, here that we need to learn so many things nowadays that it's not necessarily good news to learn that we need to learn something else. But yeah, anyway. However, yeah, so like I said, it's not super hard to learn. If you really want to learn, you can learn it, and there are resources online. Yeah, you can find ways to learn this. The second limitation, this one is big as well. The export starts only when you set it up, meaning that there is no retroactivity. So, like I said, remember I mentioned in the advantages the fact that you can, on paper, analyze more than 16 months of data. The issue is that if you set it up today, you will have only 1 day of data tomorrow. So you start from scratch, basically. There's no retroactivity. So it means that it is a big disadvantage when you start now with the bulk export. That's why if you want to use it, set it up as soon as possible, because otherwise you won't be able to go back in time. So that's a problem. A little note regarding this, you can use technically the API to, I did that recently for clients. You can pull the data from the API and export some of it. It won't be complete. Like I mentioned, there is more data in the bulk export versus the API, but there are some workarounds to get a bit of data, at least from the last 16 months, and get the bulk export data starting from now if you set it up now. But yeah, by default, you will only have data starting from now. The next limitation is the fact that, in something that I really regret this limitation as well, the fact that unfortunately the bulk export only exports the data from the performance tab. So you know what I mean? I don't know if you know what I mean, but basically you will only get the data from the performances of your website from the Search Console. You won't have data regarding your website problems, indexation problems, I don't know, penalty issues or stuff like this, which is kind of a shame. I would like to have that as well in BigQuery, but it's not something that is incorporated in the export for now. So it's another limitation. And lastly, last limitation, this one is not necessarily a big one, but I mentioned earlier that it is free. It's not entirely true, in the sense that first of all, when you set up the bulk export, you need to add a payment method. So it means that Google wants to make sure that you will pay if there is something going on. Second of all, over time, you might pay. Why? Because BigQuery builds on there are two elements that are considered regarding the use of BigQuery and the free use of BigQuery. The first one is the amount of data stored. So if you store a lot of data, and when I say a lot, it's a lot. I don't have the number in mind. I always forget it. But basically, Google gives you for free a lot of gigs, a lot of data. However, if you go over that threshold, you might be paying every month, basically. Okay, but the threshold is quite high. I don't remember, but I think it's 20 gigs or something like that. So it's a lot of data for free initially. But if you go over it, well, you will pay. But the second element that is taken into consideration is actually more of a problem most of the time. When you end up paying with BigQuery, usually that's the second reason that explains it. It's your queries, basically, your SQL queries. If your SQL process a lot of data, you can run queries that process 10 gigs of data, for instance. If you run a lot of them that process a lot of queries, a lot of data, sorry, you might be paying as well. There is a threshold as well, and I invite you. You can go check in Google Cloud documentation. You just have to go on Google and type BigQuery cost, and you will find the documentation. It's relatively clear. So again, regarding that point, it is free. but depending on your usage, depending on the amount of data you store, the amount of data you process in your queries, you might be paying at some point. But I'm going to be honest with you. The Search Console bulk export, especially if you only use the data from it, is not huge. It depends on your website, obviously. If you work on a website with a lot of traffic, a lot of keywords and more, it might be bigger than some other websites, but it's not GA4, for instance, has way more data than the Search Console, for instance. So with the data sets I worked with lately, the amount of data is not that big. That's what I mean. All right. So those were the limitations. Okay, so what can we do with this? So I'll talk about a few examples, but obviously you can do way more than that because there are many, many things you can do basically with this. So first of all, it's obvious, but I have to say it. You can run all the analysis you usually run in the UI or with other tools connected to the Search Console, but with more precise data and more granularity, possibly. It depends on the tool, obviously. But as I mentioned, the API has less fields than the bulk export, but it depends on what you need. Sometimes you don't necessarily need the extra fields. So that's why I mentioned it depends what you do and what tools you are using. So for instance, you can have stats with 2 dimensions together, the URL plus the query. It's not something you can do in the UI, for instance, easily. So yeah, it seems very simple, but it's just something that simple is very easy to do in BigQuery. The second example is checking your statistic regarding the anonymized queries. As I mentioned earlier, there's no other tool that does that out of the box easily. This one is in the bulk export. You can do that very easily and more precisely than with any other tool. Other ideas? You can do some seasonal trend analysis. If you are more than, like if you have 2 years of data, for instance, again, it depends when you set up the bulk export. But if you have like 24 months of data, you can compare 2 years easily. It's not something you will be able to do in the UI. You can check the percentage of pages that have 0 clicks. You can get the unique query count per page. You can analyze large volume of search and click data to identify trending and high opportunity keywords. You can analyze branded versus non-branded keywords. You can filter keywords based on, we'll talk about it later on, but based on questions, based on some like filters. You can do a lot of stuff like this. You can also analyze queries lost and gain. And you can, more advanced examples, you can blend the data with external tools such as Dragon Metrics, for instance, or even like your CMS, your internal database, your CRM, or even like with log analysis or even a crawl, for instance. And so this is quite nice. By the way, I did that recently. I joined data from a crawl with the Search Console, and I was able to see, like for instance, the pages with by the way, a lot of tools already do that, but you can use the data from the bulk export for that. So that's a bit different because of this. But yeah, you can like cross this data and identify, for instance, pages with high potential traffic or high traffic that ended up in 404, stuff like this. You can do a lot of things like this. Last example, this one is very interesting as well. I mentioned earlier that you can use the natural language API from the Google Cloud Platform. So with that, in BigQuery, you could, and depends on what you want to do, obviously, but you could do like keywords categorization, sentiment analysis, and even more with the NLP. So it's also something quite interesting we can do directly in BigQuery as well. All right, so let's review how to set it up. As I mentioned earlier, it is quite simple. However, I'm going to be honest with you. It's simple, but there's a few tricks here and there. We'll review them together. So the first step is you have to create a Google Cloud project. So you have to go in Google Cloud. You have to create a project, And one particularity with the bulk export, as I mentioned earlier, you need to add a billing profile to your project. I don't detail it today because we won't have time to go through that, but you need to have a billing profile which is tied to your project in order to make the bulk export work. If you don't do that, it's not going to work, because as I mentioned earlier, Google wants to make sure that your project is out of what they call the sandbox mode. The sandbox mode is when the project is free, because you can use BigQuery for free, by the way, with some tools like GA4, for instance. But if you want to use the full version of a project, you need to add a billing profile with payment method attached to it. So you create your project, you tie a billing profile to it, and you're ready to go to the next step. The next step is to set up the bulk export. So you go in the Google Search Console property you want to work with. You go in the settings section, you click on bulk data export, and here you see in the first field, Cloud Project ID, you need to add the ID from the project you created initially. This project has an ID, so you need to add it here. The dataset name, by default, it's going to be Search Console. This is the name of the dataset that is going to show up in BigQuery. It's going to be created automatically by the Search Console. So you can name it on something else if you want, but yeah, usually it's so I usually tend to keep it Search Console. And you can set a dataset location as you wish. Last thing, unfortunately, there is a last step. This one is a bit more tricky, because I absolutely hate the access and permissions management in BigQuery in Google Cloud. I think it's extremely complex for nothing, I think. But you need to add a user to your project. So here it's detailed how you need to do that. You need to go in the IAM and admin section in Google Cloud. Then you go in, click grant access, and you need to add this user. It's always going to be that user, by the way. It's what we call the service account. And you need to grant at least those two roles to the user, BigQuery job user and BigQuery data editor. Once it's done, it should work. All right. So, but you need to do all of this. Otherwise, you are going to run into issues. And Sarah, you let me know, but I can share the presentation after as well, because there are links here. There are not that many of them, but there's one here. So yeah. All right. So we can maybe check a few examples before going through your questions, if you have any. So I'm gonna be honest with you. I have to warn you, those are very simple examples, but I don't want to scare you because SQL can be extremely complex. I don't know if a lot of people here have experience with SQL. SQL can be very simple depending on what you do, but it can be extremely complex as well if you want to do more advanced stuff. Like for instance, joining data between different data sources, or run into comparisons or things like that. It gets way more complex in that case. So I'm going to show you two simple examples just to show you how it works in the interface and what is the output yeah. So the first one is very simple. We're going to basically, we're going to create one of the two tables that the Search Console bulk export creates, because the bulk export creates actually three tables, one which is a log of the exports, and two other tables, one which is the search data site impression, which is data at the site level. If someone here used the connector with Looker Studio with Search Console, you probably know that there is already that distinction between site and URL. If you use the API, there is also that distinction. So here in that case, I am querying the site impression table, but there is also a URL impression that we're going to query after. So in that case, we query that table, and we're going to pull the data from query. So query is the keyword. We're going to sum the clicks and the impressions for each query. We're going to select data from the first of April. I forgot what fourth word. So April and to the 15th of April. And if you check the line 10 of the code here, we also make sure to remove the anonymized query because it's going to make some noise that we don't necessarily want to have. And we sort the results based on clicks descending. So that's what we do here. And the output is this. So again, it's very simple, but that's what we get here. I can show you quickly in the interface what it looks like. It's already here, but I can maybe, this first example, I can show you and explain to you very quickly what it does. So one way to query easily a table. So the tables are here, you see? Those are the two tables that were created automatically. There is a URL and the site. So in that case, I'm going to query the site impression table. And I'm going to select the fields that I want. So query, clicks and impressions. And like I said earlier, I want the sum of the clicks and the impressions for every query. So to do that, I need to use what we call functions that actually sum the things. I'm going to use aliases to make sure that each column has a name. So to do that, I need to use as. To select dates, I need to use the where clause. So I don't remember what were my dates, but it's data date between, I think it's 2024, something like that. And again, if you never used SQL, don't be scared. That's normal. If you never used it, it might look weird. So group by, we won't have time to go through everything, but group by basically allows to aggregate the data for the query here, to have only one line per query, basically. That's what it does here. And we're going to order by clicks descending here. Do I have an error? No, this is good. So I can run it. And this is the output here. So as you can see, this is fake data, by the way. So, and yeah, there's a bit of a problem here, but it doesn't really matter for our example. So I can see here what are the keywords with the most clicks. And I have, again, no limitation. It's raw data here. I can export it. I can use it in a table or stuff like that. And this is a very simple example. So let's review a little bit more complex example. So this second example, here what we do is basically we count the amount of queries for the date we selected, which is here the 20th of April, 2024. And here we are counting the amount of, among all the keywords we have, we count the amount of queries which were anonymized versus non-anonymized, right? So this is this one. I already, yeah, to save some time, I don't, it's already here. So if I run it at the bottom, so see here, we do some data manipulation. We use what we call a case statement. A case statement allows us to create some logic in there. And in that case, we say if the keyword is anonymized, you note it as anonymized. If it's not anonymized, you flag it as non-anonymized, and we count the amount of rows which match either of the conditions. And here we have the total. So you see that day we have 48 keywords which are anonymized, and we have 163 keywords which are not anonymized. So that's another example, quite simple as well, but that allows you to check your data like this. All right, so that was it. So Sarah, let me know if there are questions. I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much. I think that was really useful and kind of opened up a whole new world of possibilities for many people like myself. Does anybody have any questions in the, if they want to put them in the Q&A box? We can look at them and answer them now. Oh, I see everybody's quite quiet. Hopefully we haven't scared you. Okay, I have a question from Julia. What can you do with anonymized queries? As in, can you get any insights from them?
So you can, first of all, you can understand what is the amount of data that you don't actually see regarding queries, keywords. And it's not something you really see in the UI or with the API. So it's the first reason why you would want to see that. So it's more to be aware of what you're not seeing in your data, basically. And you can segment the data and see the amount of clicks, the amount of impressions, and more that actually are kept away from you because of privacy reasons. So that's the main reason, to be honest. So it's not necessarily super insightful, but it's a good information to have to understand better the data you have, basically.
Thank you. Any other questions? Do you have any recommendations on how to get started with NLP for categorizing keywords?
That's a very good question. Honestly, I don't really have, well, there is one thing I could recommend. I'm messing around with it recently, so that's why I don't think there is a Google official documentation when it comes to the natural language API, so you can check this out. But you can also check a solution like, it seems stupid to say that, but ChatGPT or Perplexity or alternative like this, because they can actually help you start using them. But yeah, again, I would say the documentation is a good start. But unfortunately, if you make some research, you will see that everything related to BigQuery and especially the bulk export, there's not that many documentation online. So that's why if you want to go further, if you have more questions, LLMs can be sometimes a solution, or the community, maybe if you have access to one, can help you. But yeah, unfortunately, there are not that many resources. But I would start with the official documentation. I would guess. That's what I did.
Thank you. Any other questions?
And by the way, the NLP is not it's probably one of the most complex things you might do, maybe. So if you want to start, maybe don't start with that, because it's maybe more complex than just messing around with the data. I would start with something more simple initially if you start. If you don't, that's another question. Yeah.
I could do a shameless plug here and say get started with Tag Assistant within Dragonmetrics, because that can kind of automate segmentation for you based on certain words that you've got as well, if you want to get started with. It's pretty useful. Okay, enough with that. Any other questions? Everybody's really quiet.
Well,
I might
it means everything's clear and good, Sarah. So I'm fine with that. So it means that you need to work with it and play with it a little bit, and you will see questions will arise when you will play around with it. So yeah.
Definitely. I actually have one final question for you, and that is, so for somebody like me who is looking at, for example, SQL for the first time in my life today, where can I go to learn more about it?
This is a very good question. So you can go on Google and check for free courses, free resources. Obviously on BigQuery Pro, by the way, we do have some SQL basics as well, because you need to learn SQL to use that solution. You can't go around it, unfortunately. But there is also, and unfortunately, I don't have the link in mind nor the name in mind. That's why I hesitate mentioning it. But there are games that exist I know my wife learned a little bit of SQL that way, that allow you to learn SQL. Maybe Sarah can share it to you after. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the link. I should have kept it around. Otherwise, LLMs as well are useful. Honestly, I'm always skeptical when it comes to LLM with code, because my experience shows that when you don't necessarily know very well the language, the programming language, it might be a bit misleading to use an LLM, because the LLM sometimes doesn't necessarily do exactly what should be done. And if you don't necessarily understand completely what you're doing, you might not see what's wrong with the code. So that's why it's not necessarily great. But when you start, it's actually something that could work well. And over time, it can work well. And I know a lot of people, actually professional developers, which I'm not, that use ChatGPT, for instance. So it's actually, those tools are actually, and Copilot is even more popular when it comes to that. So it can be totally used. Like, for instance, you can explain and be very throughout when you build your queries to ChatGPT or else. You explain clearly what you want to do with what you have to explain, that is data from the Search Console, from the bulk export, and that you need that dimension with those metrics, and you explain clearly what output you want. And the LLMs most of the time do something useful, not always, but yeah. So it can be also a way to learn, I think, because the goal again is not to have it done all the work for you, because again, I don't think it's that powerful nowadays still to always do it. But it can be a good way to start your query, and then maybe work around a little bit with it, because yeah. So yeah, but if you can, there are also courses online and more. And one good news is that, as I mentioned earlier, it depends on what you want to do, but the data from the bulk export is actually not super complex. It's not like, for instance, I work with GA4 in BigQuery as well. And with GA4, it's very complex, really complex, because the way the data is stored is quite complex. In the Search Console, it's very flat, the data structure. So you can access the different fields very easily. There is no complexity of regarding this. The main complexity is really related to SQL and with more complex outputs that you want, basically. But yeah, the initial work with SQL is not super complicated. Yeah, I would say.
Well, thank you so much. For everybody who's still here, I will send out the recording tomorrow, and I'll also send out the slides as well with it, so that you can take a look at them if you need to. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm sure you can connect with Augustin. And yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.